RT is sitting down with journalist and author Sasha Abramsky. Sasha, thank you very much for sitting down with us today.
My pleasure.
Your latest book focuses on hunger and poverty in the United States. How bad is the situation?
It's very bad, and what got me interested in this story was we tend to think of ourselves as a very affluent country. We tend to think of our recessions as extraordinary exceptions to the rule. We tend to think that they're short-term. We tend to think that generally, if you're willing to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can do anything because we're a land of dreams, we're a land of opportunity. And it's a wonderful narrative, and it's partly true. But it also ignores the fact that there's a lot of poverty, a lot of very extreme poverty that oftentimes manifests itself in terms of hunger, in terms of anxiety about where the next meal is going to come from, or where enough cash is going to come from for the most basic things in life, rent, medical bills, just things that normal middle-class existence takes for granted. In terms of the numbers, there's about 33 million people on food stamps in this country at the moment. There's about 10 million more poor enough for food stamps but not on food stamps. And then there's this groundswell of near poverty, people who have jobs but their hours have been cut, or they have jobs but the wages just don't stretch to cover the month's bills. And there's several tens of millions more in that category. And those are the ones who increasingly are showing up on food bank lines, on bread lines. They're the new face of poverty in 2009 America. If you add up all the numbers, you're probably looking at about 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 Americans are either officially categorized as poor and hungry, or are close enough to being poor and hungry that in an everyday situation it doesn't make much difference. It's about 50 or 60 million Americans. It's an absolutely huge number of people.
Did this number increase when the United States was hit by the recession?
Absolutely. When the economy as a whole began collapsing in 2007 and then the collapse accelerated in 2008, the numbers got worse. Because what happened was the people who were already vulnerable, the people who were one paycheck away from poverty, suddenly they didn't have a paycheck. So those people sank into poverty. Or the people who were just about scraping by, they were going a little bit hungry at the end of each month. Suddenly, as their hours were cut, they were going hungry for a week or 10 days out of the month. So I think what we saw is the poverty was there, the conditions for the poverty were there, independent of the recession. But the recession basically magnified everything. It magnified all of the bad trends in the economy. It increased the levels of anxiety. It increased the levels of unemployment, the levels of uninsurance for health care. It increased the levels of homelessness. All the things that we think of as sort of reliable indicators of poverty went up in the last year, year and a half, 2 years. And they've stayed high. At the moment, as a legacy of the last quarter century of economic policy, we got this sort of cascading crisis of poverty. It's percolating upwards, so it might have previously affected maybe 10, 15% of society. Now we've got 20 or 25% who on a daily basis are just very, very vulnerable.
Out of the people who are suffering, how many of them are children?
A disproportionate number. When you break it down, you have two categories of people who are particularly vulnerable to hunger and to poverty, and that's elderly people. And then the other category is children. And as I went around the country, one of the things I found was time after time in poor communities, the single most hungry group was children. I think that's one of the most shocking things at the moment, is that the very poorest group of people are kids, the people that we tend to think of as needing the most protection, but they're the ones for whom the social safety net is failing most explicitly at the moment.
Is there an end in sight to all of this?
I think one of the risks is that we have a jobless recovery, that we could have certain measures of economic recovery. We could see the stock market rising for a few months in a row. We could see productivity going up. We could even see a little bit of a dip in unemployment, but we're still going to have these huge pockets of unemployment. We're going to have areas that have just been decimated by the recession. You might have jobs that eventually emerge, but they're going to be for a younger group of workers with different skills. And the workers who've lost their jobs in this recession, many of them are going to be on the scrap heap. And they're going to face this sort of many year period where they just do not have adequate income. And these are the guys who increasingly are showing up on food lines. They're the modern face of a breadline culture.
Who and what got the United States here?
I think it's a combination of events, and some of them are somewhat random and unpredictable, and some of them are entirely predictable, and we chose to ignore them. And by the end of last year, we were seeing cascading poverty in every sector of the economy. And that was a policy choice. Another policy choice was we utterly failed to shore up the pension system. So as one large company after another declared bankruptcy specifically so they could get out of pension obligations, instead of government regulatory agencies stepping in and saying, look, this is bad. We don't want a society where elderly people lose their pensions. Government sat back and let that happen. Again, that was a policy choice.
If so many people are in trouble, why do you think the American government would continue to ingest billions of dollars into something like defense?
I think there's many things that the government has obligations towards. One of them is defense. You can make an argument as to whether we spend too much or whether some people say we spend too little. I don't think anybody's going to say America should literally fold up its defense obligations or its military obligations and go home. Nobody's going to be taken seriously if they say that. But you can certainly make an argument that we're spending too much on defense, that we're spending too much on pork barrel projects, that we're spending too much on shoring up failed companies, and that we're not spending enough actually protecting people's economic interests. We're not spending enough protecting pensions, as I said. We're not spending enough on health insurance for the poor and so on. And so we need this new discussion of what our priorities are.
Let's change the topic a little bit. A large part of your work focuses on the U.S. prison system. What are the main drawbacks here?
I got very interested in how a country that defines itself as being a democracy can at the same time go off on an incarceration tear, starts in the 1970s, continues to the current moment, which transforms America into the single largest incarceration country on earth. We began out-incarcerating Russia, out-incarcerating China, out-incarcerating every other country on earth, whether they're authoritarian or democratic. We went from a country with about 100 people per 100,000 incarcerated to about 1,000 people per 100,000 incarcerated. So about 1% of the American adult population now lives behind bars.
Is America a record holder in terms of numbers when it comes to the number of prisoners in the U.S.?
Yeah, we have some good records, we have some bad records. And one of our worst records is that we have about 2.3 million people in prison and jail, and that is a record. There's no other country on earth in absolute numbers with that number of prisoners, no other country on earth as a proportion of their population with that number of prisoners. It's an unfortunate record, and it's one that possibly in this economic recession will begin to reverse itself. Not for moral reasons, but simply because there's less money available for states to fund these large prison systems. So we might start seeing a sort of gradual rollback in the prison systems.
Why does the United States continue to practice capital punishment? A lot of large, developed democratic nations have abandoned this practice.
It's a state-by-state issue. So when we say the United States practices capital punishment, in actuality, even though most states have it on the statute books, most states don't implement it. It's a handful of states, Texas, Virginia, Oklahoma, 3 or 4 other states, that routinely execute prisoners. And even in those states, over the last 3 or 4 years, the number of executions has declined very, very rapidly. And the popular support for the death penalty is still there, but it's far less strong. It used to be about 80%, it's now about 60%. Why do we have it? I think it's complicated. I think there's a long conservative history of criminal justice policy in the southern states in particular.
You don't find it surprising that as much as 60% of Americans still support the death penalty?
I actually don't, because when you poll in many, many countries, you find, and this is what I was saying about the difference between a system with a sort of democratic criminal justice system and one with a bureaucratic one. Many countries abolished the death penalty despite a popular support for it. In America, it's very much a decision that voters have a direct stake in. And so it doesn't surprise me that a majority support capital punishment. I find it sad, and I hope that as more and more evidence comes in that it doesn't serve as a deterrent, as more and more medical evidence comes in that a large number of people subjected to the death penalty had mental illness and so on, I would hope that support for it erodes. For me, the far larger problem is that we dramatically over-incarcerate people in this country for very, very minor offences in many cases.
My last question is about Guantanamo prison camp. Have any of the detainees received fair judicial treatment through your eyes?
What I would say about Guantanamo is it doesn't meet international standards. That's obvious. I don't think the administration would challenge that at this point. It's a secretive process. The evidence that's been presented in these cases, oftentimes the defense doesn't even have access to the evidence. And it was deliberately constructed as a prison outside of the U.S. legal structures. The Bush administration made an argument that that the prisoners had to be in Guantanamo because they were so dangerous they couldn't be onshore. That didn't make much sense because America's super maximum security prisons like Pelican Bay, like Corcoran in California, some of the federal prisons in Arizona and elsewhere, they're the most secure facilities on earth. Nobody escapes from them. They're almost escape-proof. And I've been in many of them and reported on many of them. So, the idea that a handful of prisoners on Guantanamo were literally superheroes who would escape through the walls of a prison like Pelican Bay didn't make much sense. To me, it was always about wanting a certain category of prisoner in extrajudicial territory, in an area where they really were hardly subject to U.S. laws and they were largely invisible to the media. And I think that's, you can't do that. When you fight against terrorism, you have to win on ideas as well as on the battlefield. And the best way to win in the realm of ideas is to say, look, we have a better system. We have an open system. We have a democratic system. We have one which gives defendants rights. And you can't say, well, these are really bad guys and therefore they shouldn't have rights, because the whole point of a criminal justice system is even the really bad guys have rights. That's the whole principle of a defense system.
Sasha Abramsky, thank you very much for your time with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.